Everybody knows one or two of those people who equate being joked about as the same thing as being persecuted or being insulted. Like, if a late night host cracks a joke, it's suddenly a federal crime. Well, I'm kidding. Most of us don't get talked about by late night hosts, but this week, Donald Trump went on another Truth Social tirade, this time about Seth Meyers, accusing him of breaking the law by mocking him on TV. But here's the thing. There was once a law that talked about fairness and balance in broadcasting, and another that still exists about giving candidates equal time on air. Neither of them, though, say, don't hurt Donald's feelings. Today, we're unpacking the Fairness Doctrine, the equal time rule, and Trump's never-ending war on jokes. Because understanding what those things really mean tells us a lot, not just about American media, but about one man's obsession with controlling it. Hello, you're listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host. And today we're going to be talking about the president's latest tantrum, this one about his unfair and maybe even illegal treatment at the hands of Seth Meyers, host of NBC's Late Night with Seth Meyers. Just the latest focus of Trump's ire. Think Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert. The president has once again demonstrated himself to have the thinnest of skin, particularly when it comes to comedy. But before we wade into all of that, let's take a look at some hot topics. Recent reports that came out this week are indicating that the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, the same basic technology that so many of us got or didn't during the pandemic, may help certain cancer immunotherapies work better. That's huge. But equally important, how people spreading anti-vaccine narratives are misinterpreting or deliberately twisting bits of this science, and that matters for all of us. So let's walk through it. What the science says, what the caveats are, what it doesn't say, why it matters for you or your loved ones, and then the misinformation angle, how the anti-vax crowd, including major players, respond, what the risk is for public health, for individuals, for trust in medicine. Okay, first, what is going on? A cluster of papers and conference reports published just recently show something surprising. For patients with advanced non-small cell lung cancer, NSCLC for short, or melanoma, a serious skin cancer, who were getting immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy, so therapies that help the immune system attack the cancer, there was a big difference if those patients had received an mRNA COVID-19 vaccine within about 100 days of starting that therapy. The vaccinated group, in some data sets, had substantially better overall survival than those who didn't get the vaccine. On the laboratory side, in animal work, combining mRNA vaccine type activity plus checkpoint inhibitor therapy showed slower tumor growth. So, in plain terms, imagine someone has cancer that's being treated with a cutting-edge immunotherapy drug. The data so far suggest if they got an mRNA COVID-19 shot around the same time, their immune system might be in a better state to make that immunotherapy work. Now, let's dig into why this might make sense, even if might is the key word. The mRNA vaccines for COVID-19 are designed to do a couple of things. They strongly stimulate what we call the innate immune system. For example, type 1 interferons, antigen-presenting cells, and they prime adaptive responses. In more everyday terms, the vaccine gives the immune system a wake-up call, gets it alert, and revved up, ready to see targets. In cancer immunotherapy, one of the big problems is that tumors can be cold, meaning the immune system isn't recognizing them well, or the tumor has ways to hide or suppress immune attack. So the idea is, if you vaccinate or stimulate the immune system around the time the therapy is started, you might reset or amplify the anti-tumor immune cycle, making the tumor more visible, make the therapy work better. The early preclinical animal data supports this idea. Vaccinating plus checkpoint inhibitor equals stronger anti-tumor response. So, summarizing, the mRNA shot provides a kind of immune boost or primer, and the immunotherapy drug does its job. Combined, they might produce a greater effect than the therapy by itself. But, and this is a big but, this is not proof that the COVID mRNA vaccines cure cancer. We must be very clear. The human data so far are retrospective, that's look-back analysis of medical records, not randomized controlled trials. That means the patients who got the vaccine might differ in other important ways: health status, access to care, timing, other treatments, from those who didn't. That selection bias would need to be eliminated in further testing. So, the actual message here, this is exciting, potentially important, but preliminary. Not something to change medical practice yet without future trials. Clinical trials are now being planned to test this formally. And one more caveat. It does not mean that vaccines cause cancer or that people should think the vaccine is a substitute for standard cancer therapy. That would be a large misunderstanding and a very dangerous one. Now, to put this in broader context, there is a body of work independent of COVID vaccines on mRNA-based cancer vaccines, vaccines that encode tumor antigens, unique proteins on cancer cells, so that the immune system can be trained to attack the tumor specifically. These are still experimental, early phase trials. None yet are fully approved for general use in cancer treatment. What's interesting is the COVID mRNA vaccine findings raise the possibility that widely available mRNA shots, i.e. ones already approved for COVID, might serve as a non-specific immune primer or adjuvant in the combination with immunotherapy, rather than a targeted tumor vaccine per se. In other words, even though the shot wasn't designed for cancer, its immune activating effects might be helpful in that setting. So if the retrospective data hold up and are followed by trials, we might see a new strategy, immunotherapy plus mRNA vaccine or similar immune priming approach to improve outcomes, and that's potentially big. So some basic ideas for what do you, the listener, or someone you love, need to take away from this. I'd put it like this. If you or a loved one has cancer and is going to start immunotherapy, checkpoint inhibitor, bring this to your oncologist's attention. Mention that you've heard these reports about mRNA COVID shots and immunotherapy synergy. They may already be aware or may know of trials, but don't assume. They may still say, we don't have enough data yet. If you're otherwise healthy, or have had cancer but aren't in that specific scenario, this doesn't mean you should expect your standard vaccine to behave like a cancer vaccine. It does not. And very importantly, don't interpret these findings as evidence that the mRNA COVID vaccines cause cancer. On the contrary, the evidence suggests potential benefit, and there's no plausible mechanism for mRNA COVID vaccines creating cancer, despite what some anti-vax claims might say. In fact, large safety surveillance studies have found no increase in cancer incidence after vaccination. So the door is open. Exciting possibility, but medical advice, individual circumstances, ongoing trials all matter. Now let's turn to the part I promised, how the anti-vax movement, especially figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and misinformation about vaccines intersect with this topic, and why that matters for science, for public trust, and for people's health. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been a long-standing and prominent figure in the anti-vaccine or vaccine skeptic movement. Although he claims he's not anti-vaccine, the evidence strongly suggests his views and actions align with anti-vax rhetoric. He and his affiliated group, Children's Health Defense, have spread significant information about vaccines, including those for COVID-19. Now, why this matters in this context. When the science about vaccines helping cancer immunotherapy comes out, it's a counter-narrative to the broad vaccines are harmful message. If people have been primed by anti-vax messaging to distrust vaccines altogether, they may dismiss or ignore this good news, creating a lost opportunity for possible benefits. The anti-vax movement has propagated claims like vaccines cause cancer, for example, the turbo cancer myth, which are absolutely false. So when credible science shows vaccination may help in cancer therapy, misinformation can sow confusion. Wait, first they say vaccines cause cancer, now they say vaccines fight cancer. Which is it? That confusion can erode trust in doctors and health systems and new treatments in general. Misinformation doesn't only harm the individual who refuses a vaccine, it harms public health infrastructure, slows uptake of beneficial interventions, and may prevent people from participating in the very trials that could improve outcomes for cancer or other diseases. Trust is fragile. When high-profile figures undermine vaccine confidence for non-medical reasons, political, financial, ideological, it can spill over into areas like cancer therapy, where research and collaboration require a shared faith in science. For example, Kennedy's anti-vax activism has been linked to undermining the HPV vaccine, which is proven to prevent cancer, and thereby undermining cancer prevention efforts. Now, a person reading sensational headlines might say, vaccines cause cancer or vaccines cure cancer, misunderstanding both sides. They might refuse a vaccine thinking it's unsafe, or they might wrongly think a vaccine alone will cure their cancer and decline other proven therapy. That, of course, is dangerous. If folks distrust mainstream vaccine science, they might refuse to participate in clinical trials of mRNA cancer vaccines or combinations, delaying the progress. The more vaccine mistrust spreads, the more hesitant patients and providers may become, and the harder it is to translate this exciting possibility into a possible real-world benefit. So, what can we do? And what do you say to the people who you care about? Encourage evidence-based conversation. The science here is preliminary, but it's promising. Emphasize the difference between may help and a cure. Remind people that despite the misinformation they hear, that vaccines have strong safety records, including large studies showing no increased cancer incidence after COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. Help people separate individual decision-making, talking to your oncologist or doctor, from public health choices. What policy access trust looks like. Highlight how misinformation erodes trust. And trust is currency for modern science. When people say, I don't believe the science, it's not just about one injection, one disease. It's about our collective ability to fight disease. Not just COVID, but cancer, infections, pandemics, what have you. And share stories of hope. This isn't doom and gloom. There's exciting science here. Use that to build trust, not to frighten. Now, you may be thinking, okay, I'm not a cancer patient. I'm not an oncologist. Why should I care about this? Well, good question. Here's why. First of all, many of us are connected to someone who might face cancer. A parent, a spouse, a friend. If you ever find your loved one in that scenario, knowing this info could make a difference. Second, this story is a microcosm of a bigger thing. When new science findings, especially promising ones, interface with broader societal issues, public trust and misinformation and politics, everyone is affected. What happens with cancer and vaccines today might mirror what happens with other diseases tomorrow. Third, whether you like it or not, the anti-vaccine movement touches all of us. When large segments of the population decline vaccines or mistrust them, we all become more vulnerable. Higher risks for outbreaks, weaker herd protection, and slower progress in medicine overall. That means any of us, our kids, our communities, may feel the ripple effects. Fourth, knowing this gives you a voice. If someone you know says something like, vaccines cause cancer, or science says vaccines are bad, you can push back. Not with arrogance, but with a few grounded facts. 1, the evidence does not show vaccines cause cancer. 2, here's new evidence that vaccines may help in cancer therapy. 3, misinformation thrives when we stay silent or when we don't ask, show me the data. So where do we go from here? On the science front, randomized controlled trials are needed. Observational studies are good, but they don't prove cause and effect. We are now entering that next phase. On the policy frontline medicine front, if trials confirm benefit, oncologists may consider timing of vaccination, coordination between immunotherapy start and vaccine timing, maybe new treatment protocols, but we're not there yet. On the public health trust front, the next challenge is translating promising science into trustworthy practice and doing so in a way that builds, not erodes confidence. That means transparent communication, avoiding hype, and acknowledging uncertainty where it exists. On the individual level, if you're in or know someone in a situation of cancer plus immunotherapy, bring this up with the oncologist. Ask, are you aware of the recent data about mRNA COVID vaccine plus checkpoint inhibitor synergy? Is there a trial available? Should I consider timing of vaccination? If you're not in that situation, stay informed, but don't overinterpret. One size does not fit all. And as far as the misinformation is concerned, keep watch. When you hear claims like vaccines cause cancer or vaccines are worthless, or conversely, if someone says vaccines cure cancer, pause. Ask, what's the study? Who funded it? Is it retrospective or randomized? And is this being spun for a political or ideological purpose? Also, if you come across friends, family, community members captured by anti-vax narratives, this can be an opening. Use what we discussed, not with lecturing, but with curiosity. I heard something about vaccines helping cancer therapy. Do you have a minute to talk about it? So, to wrap up, what we've got is a story of hope. Newer science suggesting that mRNA COVID-19 vaccines might amplify certain cancer immunotherapies. That's exciting, but it comes with big caveats. Early data, specific settings, not yet actionable for everyone. And we've got a parallel storyline, the persistence of vaccine misinformation and how it threatens our ability to benefit from breakthroughs like this. Now, keeping in mind that polling information has let us down in the past, I do want to talk about some new polling that has arrived. And not that many of us will be surprised, it's ugly for President Trump. According to a recent survey by ABC News, The Washington Post, and Ipsos, 66% of Americans say the country is pretty seriously off on the wrong track under Trump. That's 2/3 of the people saying we're heading the wrong way. Now, here's what that number means and why, despite what you hear from Team Trump, the story isn't as rosy as it gets made out to be. Now, when 2 out of 3 Americans say the U.S. is on the wrong track, that's not just a mildly bad rating. It's a broad statement of pessimism. The poll finds 67% say things are going in the wrong direction, and only about 1/3 say they're headed in the right direction. 59% of respondents blame Trump for the current rate of inflation. On issue after issue, economy, tariffs, managing government, foreign relations, majorities disapprove of Trump's handling. For example, on the economy, only 37% approve, 62% disapprove. And importantly, even third-party groups, independents, lean critical. 77% of independents say the country is off track. So it's not just a partisan gripe, though partisanship still matters, but the mood among independents and non-Republicans is clearly negative. What it doesn't tell us yet, it doesn't guarantee an election outcome by itself, but it does set a stage. A large wrong track number is a big warning sign. Now, from Trump's perspective and his political operation, you want a narrative of dominance, momentum, inevitability. But when your own polling shows you underwater on direction and issue handling, that narrative really starts to crack. Now, if 2/3 of the American people think the country is off track, you're fighting an uphill battle to build a winning, we're doing great sales pitch. When your approval on key issues like the economy is 37-62, approve, disapprove, you lack the broad base of confidence that presidents typically rely on. That limits your room to make bold moves or recover from shocks. Independents matter. If you're losing them or capturing them only weakly, your path to majority support becomes more and more narrow. For the party in power, this is, of course, a risk. Midterm elections, congressional races, state contests are all influenced by national mood. When the nation thinks things are headed in the wrong direction, that often hurts the incumbent party. When you hear someone say, the polls are fake, I'm stronger than ever, while 2/3 of the public disagrees, it suggests that you're running your campaign inside of a funhouse mirror. Now, of course, we've all noticed that Trump and his allies frequently cite polls that show much, much better numbers for him. Sometimes that he's doing far better than the major national polls suggest. Now, why? And what's going on under the hood? Now, here's some key mechanics. Internal polls and campaign-specific polling run on their own surveys. They pick the sample, they frame the questions, define likely voter groups, decide weighting of questions. These internal polls often lead to more favorable results to the candidate commissioning them because they're tailored for their purposes. Selective release and spin. A campaign may leak or highlight the good internal numbers and ignore the rest. Meanwhile, public polls with transparent methodology show a different picture. This means the narrative you get from the campaign or from the White House can diverge sharply from the independent polling. There are methodological variations, differences in questions, sampling, voter definition, weighting of demographics, response modes, online versus telephone, for instance. These all produce different results, or can produce different results. One poll may show Trump at 41% approval, another at 45%. Both may be valid in their own design, but they tell different stories. For example, the ABC Washington Post Ipsos poll shows 41% approve, 59% disapprove of Trump's job performance. Then there's the managing the narrative. If you're in Trump's position, there's incentive to highlight any lead or good news version of the data, even if it's an internal poll, because you want your supporters energized and donors reassured, media attention positive. So you'll hear our internal numbers show we're way ahead, even when the public polls do not. Now, this discrepancy matters. When the public polls keep showing weak numbers and the campaign or the White House claims strong numbers, trust becomes an issue. Journalists, voters, fact checkers get skeptical. Eventually, the White House risks looking disconnected from reality. So if we put it all together, here's the takeaway. The majority of Americans believe the country is off track under Trump, and that's a big headwind. His approval ratings on core issues are weak. That constrains his political leverage. His narrative and the public data are out of sync. That mismatch matters for credibility, momentum, and strategy. What this translates to is leadership matters, public mood matters, and when large swaths of population believe things are going poorly, it puts pressure on the system, on policy, on elections, on governance. For Trump's camp, there are only so many ways to respond to this kind of challenge. Either try to rebuild trust, find what resonates with independents, shift the issues agenda to ones where you're stronger, or, dig into your base and hope turnout can compensate. And of course, that latter one is the one tried and true method that Trump consistently relies on. As far as the Democrats are concerned, these numbers signal opportunity. They suggest there's public dissatisfaction and room for messaging that says we can do better. Whether or not they take advantage of that remains to be seen. When you hear the president say, our polling shows we're winning by a mile, meanwhile, the independent poll shows that he's underwater by 18 points, either you have to assume that he's living in an alternate reality or someone forgot to bring the filter. Remember that internal polls are like the best chapter of the story, but they aren't always the whole book. The new ABC Washington Post Ipsos poll offers a clear snapshot of where the public stands right now. Skeptical, unhappy, uneasy. It doesn't guarantee a particular outcome, but it sets a significant tone. And when you hear the president and his talking heads deny this, it signals either a disconnect from reality or just the fact that they don't really care what the majority of us think. Now, they're not really a thing anymore now that we live in the age of multiple streaming platforms. But when I was a kid, when lots of us were kids, reruns were a thing that we had to deal with. And the biggest rerun these days seems to be the right's obsession with transgender individuals. It keeps coming up in Republican politics over and over and over again, even when most Americans clearly aren't losing sleep over it. So to this point, right now in Virginia, the 2025 gubernatorial race, Republicans are running ads that focus heavily, some would say obsessively, on transgender people. It's almost like they've hit the rewind button and gone back to 2024, where similar tactics were deployed on a national level. And yes, this is happening again, even though, according to polling, only 3% of voters in Virginia list that as a top concern. 3%. That's it. A tiny sliver. Yet here we are seeing this issue dominate political ads, debate talking points, and media coverage. Now think about that for a moment. Politicians are devoting energy, campaign dollars, and messaging time to an issue that by nearly every metric, the public does not rank as important. It's not on their top 5 list, not on their top 10 list, and yet it's front and center. Why? Well, part of it is strategy, a way to energize a base. It's a culture war wedge. It's a way to frame themselves as defenders of traditional values or normalcy, whatever that means. And it works with the subset of voters who are already tuned in to that kind of rhetoric. But from a wider practical standpoint, it's kind of absurd. Because here's the math. Transgender people make up roughly 0.5% of the U.S. population. Even if you round up generously, that's a tiny, tiny group. And yet the amount of political firepower directed at them is enormous. Compare that to, say, healthcare, inflation, jobs, public safety, issues that actually affect tens of millions of Americans on a daily basis. Those get a short shrift, while a small fraction of Americans are turned into a national political punching bag. It's not just Virginia. This is happening all over. State races, national campaigns, rallies, you name it. It's a definite pattern. And there's a psychological angle too. It's easier in some ways to rally people around fear than hope. Fear is immediate. Fear is visceral. It gets attention. But here's the catch. If you're an average voter, your bills are due, your kids are in school, your job is on the line, your gas and grocery bills keep climbing, you're probably not thinking about bathroom policies or gender identity issues. Most people do not prioritize it. Surveys bear this out time and time again. When asked, overwhelmingly, voters rank healthcare, the economy, education, crime, and employment as the things that matter most to them. Transgender policy? Not even on the list. Yet politicians continue to make it front and center. The right seems to have discovered a new national pastime, getting worked up over a group of people that, in the real world, they may never meet. And they've done it for years, across elections and states. It's like watching someone scream at a single ant on the sidewalk because it looks different while ignoring the entire construction site next door that's actually falling apart. But there's a consequence to this too. When politicians focus on tiny issues and culture war messaging at the expense of substantive, tangible problems, it creates a disconnect between what government does and what voters need. It encourages cynicism, frustration, and polarization. It signals to average folks, maybe politics isn't about solving problems that affect me. It's about fighting symbolic battles that energize some people and alienate others. And that's why polling numbers are so important. Even in Virginia, a state that can swing, only 3% of the voters say transgender issues are their priority. That's a sign for anyone paying attention that these ads are more about theatrics than governance. But unfortunately, theatrics work. They grab headlines. They get shared on social media. They create talking points. They keep the conversation in a certain lane, one that, fuels anger or motivates a small group of voters and distracts from accountability. So what is the average person supposed to take from this? Well, first, recognize that you're not alone if you feel baffled by the intensity of this messaging. Second, understand that what dominates the political conversation is not always what dominates the public concern. And third, remember that small targeted tactics like focusing on a population that's tiny in size can have outsized political visibility without actually reflecting voter priorities. And, finally, let's be honest, if politicians spent even half as much energy tackling issues that actually impact millions, affordable housing, healthcare costs, teacher pay, infrastructure, our daily lives might look a lot different. Right now, the only lives that look different are the lives of people who are transgendered, who are constantly being ridiculed and persecuted, and not by the average bigot on the street corner, but by the people running for public office. Unfortunately, those things that I mentioned earlier, like infrastructure and healthcare costs, are much harder to turn into a rallying cry. Fear and outrage are much easier to package. They're shareable, they're clickable, and that's why, despite representing less than 1% of the population, transgender folks keep appearing as the centerpiece of so many of these campaigns. It's a phenomenon worth understanding because it reveals a lot about political strategy, media dynamics, and the disconnect between what campaigns choose to focus on and what voters actually give a damn about. And for the average listener, it's a reminder, don't let the volume of a political narrative fool you into thinking it represents the weight of the public concern. Often it's just the loudest noise, not the most important problem. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, President Trump recently jumped on Truth Social, his personal diary of grievances, to complain that Seth Meyers should be investigated or even taken off the air for what he called illegal political bias, or insinuated could be illegal political bias. Now, if you've ever watched Late Night with Seth Meyers, you know the guy does political jokes like Stewart and Colbert and Kimmel, and before them, Leno and Letterman. All of them did it. Trump's mad because Meyers does jokes about him. And to Trump, mockery equals crime. He's referencing something he thinks is a law called the Fairness Doctrine. But, spoiler alert, it hasn't existed since Ronald Reagan was president. And even when it did, it never applied to comedy. But let's go back to the beginning, because this whole thing, fairness and equal time and presidential ego, actually tells a pretty amazing story about how American broadcasting evolved and how much one man misunderstands it. So in the early days of radio and TV, the government realized something important. There were only so many frequencies, only so many lanes on the broadcast highway. So when a station got a license, they weren't just getting to own that space. They were borrowing it from the public. The deal was simple. You can make money, you can air TV shows or radio shows or whatever, but because you're using a public resource, you've got to serve the public interest. That's where the Fairness Doctrine came in around 1949. It said broadcasters had a duty to cover controversial issues of public importance and, this is key, to do so fairly and with balance. If you ran a segment supporting one side of an issue, you had to give a reasonable opportunity for the other side to be heard. Reasonable. Not equal time down to the second, just fair coverage. So if a station ran a commentary praising the Vietnam War, they had to offer airtime to someone who opposed it. If they let a mayor defend a new zoning law, they had to let an opponent respond. What it wasn't was about jokes or opinions or celebrities on talk shows. The Fairness Doctrine was about news coverage, not whether Johnny Carson made fun of Nixon or SNL made fun of Ford. But fast forward to the 1980s. By then, we had cable, satellite, and hundreds of channels. The FCC said, you know what? The scarcity argument does not hold anymore. So in 1987, under Reagan, the FCC abolished the Fairness Doctrine, saying it actually chilled speech because stations were avoiding controversial topics out of fear they'd have to find an opposing voice. And that decision, it completely changed the media landscape. Without the Fairness Doctrine, Rush Limbaugh was able to go national. Fox News could now run commentary shows that leaned all the way in one direction, and NBC could lean the other. The result? Partisan talk radio, cable echo chambers, and the great ideological sorting of the American media. But what it didn't do, then or now, was make political jokes illegal. Now here's the other thing Trump always mangles in this topic, the equal time rule. This one is still real. It's in the Communications Act of 1934, Section 315, if you care. It says that if a TV or radio station gives airtime to one legally qualified political candidate, it has to offer the same opportunity to others running for that same office. So if NBC sells ad time to a Democrat running for mayor, they have to sell the same amount of time at the same rate to the Republican. Sounds simple, right? But here's the part that Trump just does not get, or at least pretends not to get. The equal time rule does not apply to bona fide news programs. It does not apply to interviews. It does not apply to debates, documentaries, or, most importantly, comedy shows. So when Seth Meyers tells a joke about Trump, NBC is not legally obligated to give Trump 5 minutes to stare into the camera and say, no, you're the loser. Late night shows are considered entertainment, protected speech under the First Amendment. And honestly, that's kind of the point of the whole system. Trump's claim that Meyers broke the law isn't about law, it's about ego. It's the same reason he's sued comedians, insulted journalists, and banned reporters from the press room or from rallies. He doesn't believe in fairness as a concept. He believes in flattery as a right. To Trump, if you say something nice, you're telling the truth. If you say something critical, you're fake news. And if you make a joke, well, that's illegal bias. The man has never met a mirror he didn't think was a courtroom. So let's make this real. Let's lay this out. The equal time rule. In 2015, when Trump hosted Saturday Night Live during his campaign, NBC had to offer other Republican candidates airtime, and they did. They could request equal time for appearances on local affiliates. That is the equal time rule in action. Now, the Fairness Doctrine. Back in the 1960s, a station that aired an editorial about the Civil Rights Act might have had to give a rebuttal from the other side. That is the Fairness Doctrine. It's about balance on issues, not personalities. Seth Meyers, doing his segment called A Closer Look about Trump's trials, that's commentary, satire, free speech, protected since before Trump was ever in politics. Now, let's talk about that thin skin. Thinner than a hotel Bible page. Every president since the invention of television has been roasted. JFK joked about his own hair. Reagan laughed off impressions of him falling asleep. Obama went on Between Two Ferns and roasted himself. And Trump, he calls for investigations. Late night jokes are not illegal. They're part of democracy. They're proof that we still have a country where you can laugh at power and not be hauled in for it. What Trump is asking for is not fairness. It's reverence. He doesn't want equal time. He wants exclusive time. He wants the stage, the camera, the applause, all to himself. It's easy to roll your eyes and say, oh, it's just another Trump rant. But there's a deeper danger when political figures, especially presidents, start claiming criticism should be illegal. Because that's not a misunderstanding of the law. That's a test balloon. That's how authoritarianism creeps in, by redefining disagreement as criminality. The Fairness Doctrine was about balancing ideas. The equal time rule was about giving candidates a chance. Neither was set up to protect anyone's ego. When leaders say, you can't joke about me, that's bias, what they're really saying is, I want to decide what truth is. When Stephen Miller talks about schools teaching kids American values, or they could lose funding, this kowtowing to Donald Trump is one of those values he's speaking of. And that, not Seth Meyers' punchlines, is the real threat. So here's the takeaway. The Fairness Doctrine is gone. The equal time rule is narrow. And Seth Meyers is innocent, except maybe of the crime of having really good writers. Trump's meltdown is not about fairness, it's about fragility. He doesn't understand, or doesn't want to understand, that the right to speak includes the right to mock, to criticize, to challenge. That's how you know a democracy is still breathing. Because when power can't be laughed at, that's when the joke's really over. So the next time you hear someone shout about illegal jokes or unfair coverage, just remember it has nothing to do with the law. It's about a man who's allergic to criticism, terrified of mirrors, and convinced that if everyone else just shut up, he'd finally look presidential. And that, my friends, is the opposite of fair, and a whole lot less funny. So before we wrap up this week's episode, I want to end on a high note. I want to turn our attention to a story of real human connection, something that gives a bit of hope from the ground level, even as, the big headlines swirl around us to make us depressed. In Denver, Colorado, there's a cafe called Same Cafe, SAME, which stands for So All May Eat. And this cafe has quietly become a sanctuary of dignity, community, and generosity. At Same Cafe, the model is simple. Anyone walks in, sits down, gets a nutritious, made-from-scratch meal. No judgment, no rigid price tag. Instead, diners are invited to pay what they can, or, if they're struggling, to volunteer for 30 minutes in the kitchen or bring in fresh produce to exchange for a meal, or so on. Now, that might sound modest, but in a moment like this, it matters in a big way because the backdrop is messy. Federal government shutdown has stretched out. Programs like Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, better known as SNAP, are facing pauses or delays, and a lot of people who rely on those benefits are feeling the squeeze. In Colorado and elsewhere, food prices are up nearly 25% since 2020, making every dollar hard to stretch. So here's what's happening. As this cafe opens its doors every day, it's seeing more people come through. Some because they're battling new food insecurity as the supports shift. Cafe director Carrie Shores told reporters that they're preparing to serve 100 plus meals every day if needed. And remember, this isn't a soup kitchen tucked away somewhere. It's a full cafe serving fresh, nutritious meals, locally grown produce, people in suits, and people experiencing homelessness sitting at the same tables. Loads of dignity. One diner, a man named Tyrone Maestas, unemployed for 10 months and then furloughed during the shutdown, said, "This place gave me access to healthy food and a community I absolutely needed." What I love about this story is how it ties the micro world of one cafe with the macro world of policy and economy. And it reminds us that when big programs pause, small institutions step up. When SNAP benefits are delayed, a place like Same Cafe says, "We will be here." When the shutdown notices flash on the news and the stress creeps into households, this cafe is a calm anchor. Now, we don't want to romanticize this too much. Running a pay-what-you-can model in today's cost climate is hard. The rent, the utilities, wages for staff, they're all on the rise too. Same Cafe and other similar operations talk openly about how challenging it is. But the underlying truth still remains. Generosity, community, and dignity are incredibly resilient. People want to help, and they want to eat together. And there's something deeply human about that, because if you sit down for a meal without stigma, without the feeling of I don't belong here, you're reconnecting with one of the simplest forms of social glue. You're saying, I see you, you matter. In a moment where politics and policy and headlines can make so many of us feel powerless, this cafe reminds us one plate, one conversation, one volunteer shift, those things can matter. For millions of families, SNAP isn't just nice, it's essential. When that support is delayed or threatened, you're asking people to stretch already tight resources further. You're asking them to choose between medicine and food, between rent and a nutritious dinner. And that's a stress no one should have to shoulder alone. Enter Same Cafe, because while the policy debate rages in D.C., who gets cut, who gets paused, who gets oversight, back in Denver, someone's chopping vegetables, wiping counters, greeting a stranger with a smile. Volunteers from different walks of life join hands in the kitchen. Donors who can afford to pay a little extra do so to help cover the cost for someone who can't. The model flips the script. It's not, you deserve this, but we all deserve table meal respect. If you've got the means, consider supporting places like this. If you don't, know that there are places in your community doing this work, quiet, humbly waiting for someone to walk through the doors. And if you're feeling frustrated by politics, here's a little secret. Sometimes the best politics is what happens when folks stop waiting for them to fix things and just get around the table and share a meal. So yes, political fights matter, shutdowns matter, benefits pauses matter, budget lines matter, but there are also small victories unfolding in cafes and kitchens and community tables. They're less broadcast, fewer clicks, much quieter, but they're no less real. They remind us that compassion is practical, that dignity isn't a luxury, that when policy fails or is delayed, people still show up for each other. If you're listening and you're in a position to volunteer, donate, or simply check out your local pay what you can spot, do it. If you're grappling with food insecurity right now, know that you're not alone. You're seen, you're valued, you matter. Because when a cafe says, we'll serve you no matter what, no questions asked, it's not just food, it's hope. It's community. It's a hand extended. And in uncertain times, that hand means more than we sometimes think. All right, that's it for this week's episode of Your Neighbor on the Left, where we believe politics should make you think a little, laugh a little, and maybe double check your voter registration. If you liked what you heard, share it with a friend, or better yet, share it with your most MAGA uncle. Consider it an act of public service. We want to hear from you. I can't tell you how much I value getting feedback from people, whether it's criticism or compliment or suggestion or, correction if something needs to be corrected. You can reach out to the podcast via any of the social media platforms that we use. The links for those are all on the Linktree page, and the Linktree page address is in the description of the podcast episode. You can also reach out to the podcast via email. The email address is neighborotleftpodcast@gmail.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. We'll be back on Friday with another supplemental Back Porch Files episode. So until then, stay kind, stay engaged, and as always, have the week you'd wish for others.